Welcome to part 2 of this particular tweet of the week, and this is looking at school rules that are bad because they're very difficult or impossible to enforce. So I'd like to start with 2 examples. The first example was a rule that's very common in schools but really didn't work in the setting that I was in at that time, and that was to do with lineups. Now the concept is simple with school lineups, that essentially the students line up and then are led in silence to their classroom where the lesson starts immediately. Why was this so difficult for us? Layout of the school and the length of time it took to get the class from point A at the lineup to point B in the classroom. And to give you an example of what I mean by the layout, spiral staircases. I felt at the time I was considered a strict teacher. I felt that I had reasonably good behaviour management, but if you are in a line of 30 young people going up a very tight spiral staircase, it is impossible to identify if someone is doing the wrong thing. You literally do not have a line of sight over the whole group. So talking starts. If you then add into that multiple groups being led up the same spiral staircase, you either have to be very, very organised and drag it out and have staff at each separate point, or you will find that that rule lapses very quickly. The second example I'd like to give was a rule that I just didn't really understand how to enforce it, and there wasn't really much clear guidance, and that was a rule that students could only stand in a group of 4 during break time. The thinking behind that was a key point for more serious and harmful behaviours, for example fights where there were a lot of eyes on it, so it actually created quite a dangerous situation for both students and staff. And so we were told, and the students were told, they could only be stood in a group of 4. Here's where that rule falls apart. If a group is stood in a 5, how exactly do you separate that group in a very busy break time with a lot of students around? Do you ask one person to leave? Do you ask the group to spread out? If so, how far do they need to spread out? And as soon as you got into the logistics of that rule, whether or not you think it's a good rule or a bad rule, if you're asking the staff to put it into place, we really didn't have a good understanding of what the school's expectations were. This would be a good example of when leaders need to A, talk to teachers before they necessarily create a rule, and B, ask why. If a rule is not being delivered in the way that you are expecting, rather than jump straight to criticism, talk to individual teachers. It may be that their heart is not in that particular rule, and there may be reasons for that you need to unpick. Those reasons might be shared by other staff, so again, get some feedback. Secondly, it might be, as in this instance, that really it wasn't very clear how exactly that rule was supposed to be enforced. Rules that are very difficult or impossible to enforce raise a really important question for school leadership, and that is, how are your early career teachers expected to cope with these rules and to enforce them to the level that you are asking of them? How are your supply teachers who are walking in off the street expected to enforce a rule when teachers within your current school are struggling? And that raises an interesting question of capacity. If you have the capacity, you may say, okay, we are going to direct our senior leader support or our behavioural support towards those areas to make sure that everyone feels like they can actually do what we're asking them to do with this rule. If you are in a situation where you do not have the capacity to do that, that is very challenging, and it may be that you actually need to reduce the number of rules that you are asking your students and your staff to abide by. Rules have very different levels of seriousness in terms of the impact of when they are broken, and sometimes it's not a case of the more rules the better. In fact, I would say it's definitely not. Rules are not equal in terms of their impact, so start to look at what could be put down. Secondly, you may want to shift your resources, and that is very difficult for schools because we are trying to juggle a lot of balls and produce the best outcomes for students with a limited financial backing. So what we're talking about here is putting some things down and shifting support towards behaviour for learning, towards creating a climate where students feel as safe as we can possibly enable them to feel, and that we create an environment where learning can happen. So my last point in these 2 videos is that I hope you work in a setting where you feel comfortable and confident raising if a school rule is unethical or disproportionately harsh or very difficult to enforce. The chances are that there are other people in your setting, whether students or staff, who feel exactly the same way. Leaders, I hope you feel that you are ready to respond reflectively, to ask questions of why students are struggling with a rule or why staff are struggling with a rule. And that's really a key to making behaviour management better, making behaviour for learning better by both listening and adjusting when things aren't working the way that they should. Hopefully you found something in these 2 videos interesting or thought-provoking, and if you did, please don't forget to like, comment or subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Tweet of the Week.